Hi, this is Chris Heineken, bringing you a new installment of our Insight Track series. And the goal of these interviews is to bring market trending from thought leaders in the industry and from the technology space around concepts like analytics, machine learning, and how companies are evolving to be more data-driven. And so joining me today is Philip Cooper, who is lead from a marketing standpoint for, I think it's vice president of marketing for Einstein. Is that right, Philip?
Close product management, but you're close.
All right, close,
Spend a
close.
good amount of time with the marketers as well.
Yes, it's great to have you here today. And before we get going, I do want to say a quick thanks for being so accessible to our team over the last couple of years. We do quarterly checkpoints at Atrium with the team, with Philip's teams over at Salesforce, and we compare notes on what's going on in the industry and what's going on in the market, and it's always a discussion that is well worth the time. So thanks for being so accessible for us.
And vice versa, Chris. It's a genuine pleasure.
Yeah, it's great working with you in the space. So to get things kicked off here, so I think you're coming up on, I was looking on your LinkedIn profile, looks like about year 7 with Salesforce. You could probably be considered a founding member of Einstein with that kind of background. And so you've seen a lot over the last 7 years, a lot of progression. And as you reflect back on that, overall, the different maturity points, any big themes that jump out to you across that journey?
Yeah, sure, Chris. It's been a fun journey to say the least, and it's been time has flown, as they say, which is kind of something we notice at Salesforce. It's never boring. So yeah, I was one of the early guys on the team. Shortly after we acquired the EdgeSpring engine, and I had close relationships with some folks over there back in. So that was 2013, and joined in 2014 to help launch the Analytics Cloud. It's certainly been through some really interesting phases that we've experienced over the last few years. I think getting the kind of positioning and the technology to a point of maturity where it's really delivering value. But then particularly for me, what perhaps is most interesting is looking at the inception and the goals of the technology vis-a-vis traditional business intelligence. And it was really, we didn't articulate this necessarily very effectively early on, but we began to appreciate how important the sort of embedded native elements of it were with respect to CRM users. And so for me, that's all about bringing insights and predictions and recommendation to the CRM user where they're working, less we're doing analytics and ML for the sake of for that, and then we're going to try and figure out how to integrate it for the end user. And so those two things are both very valuable, but it's fundamentally a different persona that your ultimate customer is, and a little bit of a different mindset. So I think we took a few years to figure out how important that was. And early days, it was very easy to fall into the trap of looking at it as a BI platform, which it certainly is at this point, but it wasn't intended that way. And it was hard to sort of reshape people's thinking, and people there being customers, being salespeople, being partners, analysts, everyone, that it was not another BI stack, but was very focused on native CRM, intelligent workflows, and user experience. So that was sort of I'd say one big inflection point. The second one, obviously, I don't know whether it's obvious or not, but is adding ML into the mix. So moving to really kind of, I think of it as in a couple of different ways, with the inclusion of machine learning, both natively in the experience. So I call that kind of AI inside perspective. So it's become typically referred to as augmented analytics, where you're driving a different user experience because you're using AI techniques inside. So a great example would be conversational AI, and using things like recommenders to surface the right content for a user, that kind of thing. That's all about the end user experience, but that which is extremely valuable. The other side of that coin is actually authoring, creating machine learned models, which I know, your team has been very instrumental in rolling that out. But the work of model authoring and deployment, that was a second really big inflection point. And we saw, if I look back at it, and it can coincided with the broader Salesforce goals of bringing AI into the experience across Salesforce, and with the launch of Einstein in 2016. So this was the first kind of Einstein Discovery was the first product to market, I think, at that point, along with lots of other features that emerged across the clouds. But that was really, really critical for us in, I think, kind of changing a little bit the market mindset, creating almost a new, it sounds a bit, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but it's kind of a little bit of a new category around augmented AI that a lot of others have followed, which is cool. But most importantly, it drove the business as well. So we saw a real uptick in everything really, the demand, the selling price, the revenue of the business, etc. So those are the two things I would kind of characterize as big inflection points.
Two big phases, like
Yeah.
platform phase, moving that to more actionable, and then the ML and algorithm and predictions.
Yep.
Those are the two things.
Absolutely.
And that's obviously where we connect a lot in the market, is around predictions and machine learning. Curious, so we're in these times of COVID. It's been said, at least in the predictions world, that every model that was in place went out of date with the pandemic, right? And so kind of broke the normal frontiers of what you would plan for when you're engineering features for a model.
Mm-hmm.
And curious, how are you seeing the predictions landscape playing out over the last 6 to 9 months as we've dealt with COVID? Are you seeing an acceleration around predictions, or maybe a retrenchment and hold back? What do you see?
A couple of things. It's a few points about that. Definitely an acceleration. I think the headline would be that companies are just moving faster. They're prepared. They seem to be prepared to take more risk, maybe, to take action on new use cases, new technology. Fundamentally, at the Salesforce level, digital transformation moving faster. You may have heard some examples of people, rolling out things like bots in a couple of weeks, literally, or even less, where they would have considered a project for many, many months. That kind of thing. Zion's Bank rolling out a PPP loan process in a matter of days. I've worked with them before they were a Salesforce customer years ago, and they were a bank, and they're risk averse for obvious reasons. So I think the rules seem to have changed a bit. So in general, just seeing an acceleration under the sort of broader context of digital transformation, but for ML, people taking on more use cases, which is really cool. I think there are some subtleties to the COVID situation with respect to ML models. Like, they're not. It's shone a light on the importance of ML ops and retraining and recognizing how critical is to maintain the care and feeding of your models as they're in the wild, as they're being used. So this model drift, right, as models inherently get less accurate over time. You can also get that kind of constructive feedback loop where you have a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is very, very risky, or somewhat risky, where you're predicting something and then the end user takes the prediction, and then you kind of get this feedback loop, which can be destructive. So recognizing those kind of things, I think it's probably just shone a bit more of a light on it. I don't think all the models are necessarily, the use cases are still valuable. The data have shifted, and it emphasizes the need for retraining, either automatically or driven by thresholds or driven by human control. So looking after your stuff and paying attention to monitoring the impact, not just the easy pitfall I think there is to train up as a data scientist, train up a really nice model that hits your kind of accuracy expectations, put it out there, and then it's not necessarily your job to look after it. And so we're seeing certainly more demand and more emphasis on the operational aspects of looking after ML. And again, COVID has certainly put an emphasis on that. So and I'd say it's a net positive from that standpoint.
Yeah, will be interesting. So there's all the implications of what the business climate did to the prediction space on shutdown. Now, as things start opening up, that's going to be interesting too. It's almost just as hard to figure out because
Yeah,
open process will be
absolutely.
a difficult one to manage.
Yeah, and I think from you're a business leader, making decisions about how you open up, where you invest. Some of those are good use cases for machine learning. Others are not. Some of them are more simulation.
Yeah.
You want to run scenarios. A lot of those things are even more important right now. So I've seen some anecdotal evidence to suggest that organizations are needing a faster and more and cheaper way of running kind of scenarios about how they reopen or don't, in what fashion they reopen. And they don't have the luxury of a business as usual climate to operate in.
Yeah.
So some of those things are ML centric, some of them are not. But again, I think it really speaks to the importance of kind of being agile in both how you train and deploy models and then how you look after them. That requirement has become more important. That's what I've noticed.
Curious on customer journey as you're watching models get put in place at different customers in the install base. Like one thing that we observe is there tends to be this kind of model proliferation where you start with a premise. Maybe it's a fairly simple, let's call it lead scoring algorithm. The first pass of that can be, great for the sense of giving you some insight. It can be a pretty blunt force object though. And generally what we find is over the course of time, people want to get a little bit more and more granular with their models. And we see this model proliferation where what starts as a blunt force object ends up into a whole orchestration of models that may be specialized, maybe by line of business or by geography. Are you seeing that kind of journey as companies are getting into the prediction space? How is that evolving for them?
I think you hit the nail on the head. You characterized it. I think as companies, as buyers, and the folks who in line of business who can take advantage of machine learning, they're getting more comfortable with it. They're understanding it better. I think there was a huge gap, and it's still there to be filled, of executive understanding of what this is and what it isn't, because of the AI hype curve that we've kind of gone through. I spoke, looking back 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to a lot of executives who were expecting magic, and maybe some of their opinions were informed more by Hollywood than by Silicon Valley, shall we say. That has matured, and it's much less hypey, which is good. It's also, I think, become a little bit more pragmatic on realizing that we have a lot of the techniques and the math and the algorithms they're there. We have incredible data resources, and we don't need to go to the edge case adversarial generative networks or GANs, really sophisticated things that are being done in the research space. Those are exciting, but there's this huge space for driving business value with regular machine learning. And so I think what I'm observing is customers really stepping into that journey. There's one, I'll give you I can't give you the exact numbers, but I can give you a kind of a data point that I did some brief analysis on all of the logs that we instrument everything at Salesforce, as you probably know. So we know a lot about how our technology is used. And so, for example, in the context of Einstein Discovery, we know how many people are running stories, how many models are being trained, what's being deployed, et cetera, how many predictions, actual scoring workload is being conducted, et cetera. And I noticed this kind of, from an index perspective, if you look at all of those metrics changing over the last couple of years, there was an inflection point earlier this year where the growth in deployed predictions really kind of took off. So I'm seeing a kind of movement from customers tinkering around which is that may be a little bit unfair. But they're running analysis, they're training, they're a bunch of analyses, they're training some models. Did they then put them in production? And I think in many instances, the answer a couple of years ago was no. That wasn't necessarily the imperative. The answer now is that side of the coin is accelerating and is its growth has overtaken the analysis side. So we like to do we do both in the process, right? Automated analysis with a human in the loop, more than in the loop, human controlling it. That's kind of step one: understanding your data, looking for drivers, understanding whether you have some signal, and then that necessarily creates you do a lot of back and forth with data, with feature engineering, etc. But then this step into deploying production and put it in front of an end user, that's where you're really saying, I'm betting on this thing to deliver business value, right? I've got to trust it. I'm putting it in front of users. Are they going to take advantage of it? And are they going to see value in it? So that is much harder than doing the first part,
Right.
regardless of which technology you're using. And we've seen just from my numbers looking at discovery as a platform, then we've seen a lot of growth there. So it's exciting. It's exciting to see that happening.
And that's a pretty big solve in the industry, right? So if you can, the final mile from taking a model out of the lab and putting it in production and having it be acted upon, that's a big step. Sounds like you're seeing the uptick there in a really healthy way.
Yeah, we are. And I don't want to make it's not easy. I don't know. There's a happy path which is easy, but then it meets reality of whether the human consuming this stuff is trusts it, whether it's done in the right way. Is it exposed to them explicitly? Does it run sort of more in the back end in a headless fashion and guide what they might do next? Have customers got the maturity to sort of pick the right use cases? Those kinds of things all feed into it being successful. So I'm not, it isn't a entirely solved problem, but it's great to see businesses really rolling it out, whereas certainly 2 or 3 years ago they weren't. They were much more in experimentation mode.
What's your perspective on just kind of call it the technology landscape around machine learning platforms themselves, right? So if you were to think about it in terms of, there's always these do I build versus do I buy decisions that companies are facing. So in the sense of, you got custom platform development that you can be doing with machine learning. You got some purpose-built apps that are very specific. There's a ton of them out there. How do you think, how is the platform evolution going in general in the space? What's your perspective on that?
So it's maturing. Tons of money was piled into it, both VC wise, and so tons of small companies creating niche capabilities, some cool stuff happening there. The big guys all investing, particularly those that have data access. Obviously, the Googles, the Facebooks throwing off some really cool open source things. The Microsofts, the AWSs, everyone investing pretty heavily in this area, which is great. It's really maturing. As beyond that, I think where we were again 3 or 4 years ago, it was in that very much in a hype mode. So I see this is great. I think it's good to see that that's happening. I sense that there are Salesforce's original strategy around embedding AI capabilities natively into application-specific workflows. So things in sales, service, marketing, commerce, very specific, as you kind of alluded to this, right? That seems to be being emulated around by the big mega vendors, as you'd expect. And I think that kind of lifts the tide is rising there on the expectation of how smart the user experience is. So that's good to see as well, that it's becoming, that strategy is being emulated. Platform wise, I think the underpinnings there are some really strong underpinnings for the machine learning, automation of machine learning, bits of not the end to end, but parts of it. So there's some great open source stuff, obviously. And the frameworks beneath that, like Spark is probably the most obvious one. Spark with Spark ML, and then lots of folks leveraging and building on that has meant that the bringing capabilities to market more quickly, and it's becoming more pervasive. So that to me is all just kind of good news for the industry more largely, and for customers to be able to take advantage of it. And then it's becoming, I think there's probably a realization that there's no winner in this. There's no single winner. There's no one size fits all way to do this, because the audiences are so different. So if you're a hardcore expert data scientist who's taking algorithm selection very seriously and understands the nuances between different types of tree-based models, for example, and does hyperparameter tuning and yada yada. The tools have emerged for them. What we're focused on a broader set of users, if you like, who aren't going to go that deep. And there seems to me that there's still a really large gap there between the ultimate consumer and how far expert data scientists can scale. There are more of them being trained and churned out from universities, etc. There's a lot more education happening, but there still there's a cost and scalability issue, and it's not as simple as are there enough data scientists. It's more sort of how can you throw them at problems, and how close are they to the business, etc. So we see it's the democratization theme seems to be happening. There are quite a few vendors focusing on kind of trying to scale the data science work and make that just more efficient. But I see a lot of opportunity, and also just people self-selecting into wanting to use these techniques, but not quite having the time to go and do the 2-year masters to really understand
Sure.
How to use it safely. So that's an area that we concentrate as guidance for that user who's not an expert data scientist, who knows the problems that the business can solve with machine learning in general, and who can work on it quickly, doing so safely, right? With guidance from the system, and then also being where necessary, being able to tap their data scientist friend on the shoulder and get kind of some oversight as to what they've built. So I don't know whether that helps.
It does. Yep.
There's lots going on, and lots of niche guys as well solving very specific problems. I do find that I think there's a little bit of confusion about that AI inside concept that I mentioned, where if you bake AI techniques into your solution, that's great, but can you call that AI? I would say, as more of a purist point of view, then you can't and shouldn't. It doesn't mean that solution's not much better, but it's not a platform with which to build things for customers. So it's an area, I think hopefully it's a differentiation that customers understand. Both things are important and are good, but they've been melded together in the language, I think, a little bit in the market.
Well, that's helpful, because I know companies are thinking about how do I up my odds of success when I want to enter this space, and technology and platform is a big decision point on that line of thinking. You and I were both in kind of the pattern recognition business. Mm-hmm. If you were to think through all the customers you work with, is there a particular pattern that you find for those that are getting started that leads to success in the prediction space? Any kind of one or two things you'd say, you got to nail these two things before you're going to be successful?
Other than hire Atrium?
I like that as an didn't mean it to be self-serving.
No, I couldn't resist, Chris. Couldn't resist. I think use case selection is critically important. Recognizing where machine learning is going to add value, and is understanding that it's also a hypothesis when you start, because you don't know until you've got your hands on data that are and pointed them at that use case whether you're going to get something interesting. So that's kind of goes back to my point earlier on about the level of expectation from leadership. So I think I've in terms of pattern matching, organizations that are good at finding use cases that have kind of high volume, high throughput kind of problems, by which I mean lots of people taking lots of decisions every day or frequently. That kind of thing characterizes A, you generate a lot of data. B, you're seeing lots of kind of moments at which prediction and insight and recommendation can change the outcome or improve the outcome. Versus, can I run an economic model on whether I should buy this company or invest in Indonesia or not? Something at that, a bit simplistic. I get it. One PhD with or an MBA with Excel would probably be working on the latter problem, and going to the board of directors or leadership or something. The better class of problems is there are thousands of salespeople who are going to benefit from this,
Right.
or agents or marketers or whomever.
Yep.
So I think those are some things that have emerged is resetting expectations a bit, especially for the leadership and the non-technical, non-IT data science savvy leadership, that they're getting educated on what the outcomes should be, and they're informing the problems that you go after. So is there ultimately going to be some benefit? So I think which is, maybe it's not really that different from any other IT solution, that you need sponsorship, you need a clear problem that you're trying to solve,
Right.
and then here you need data. So for most of these cases, right, unless you're doing some reinforcement learning or something.
That's great advice.
How does that resonate? I mean, what do you see? What patterns are you seeing there? Is that similar or?
Yeah, I'd say it's similar. We kind of go through a bit of a checklist to make sure that before we get going, we've got the right candidate. Use cases are obviously a huge part of that. I think figuring out what question you want to answer sounds totally obvious, but not always so in the moment. So what question do you want to answer? And if you answered that question, would it make an impact for you? Would it move the needle for the business? That's like checkbox number one, typically. Then do you have the data? Is there signal? And then, so hopefully you can check the box on that one. And then the third is, if you do have the signal and you know what question you want to answer, can you scale it, like what you said, into a user population in a big way that can act upon it and make a difference? And if you have all three of those boxes checked, you got a good candidate. So that's kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. One other area that is a little softer and harder to put a pin on is the user engagement and how they trust it and how that they would act on it.
Yep.
Which I think is one of the things that I think we're going to see a lot more of is as I mentioned earlier, headless kind of AI use cases where it's a little bit more in the back end. This kind of aligns with Salesforce talking a lot more about automation.
Yep.
And those two things are coincidental, really. But I do think there are a lot of use cases like that where you don't actually need to show someone, but you can present a much more guided experience to them. Like we enjoy this in our consumer lives with intelligent applications that we use on our phones and elsewhere, where we're not really thinking about that as an AI-powered experience, or we're not presented with something that we think, wow, the machine did that for me, and I wonder how they made it. It was just a more fluid thing that was personalized and smart. So I think those kinds of use cases, you have to worry a little bit less about how the user reacts to it, as long as you're doing a good job. The ones where you're actually exposing the user to a prediction or a recommendation, then I think it's really important, the education side of it and communicating somehow trust in what the machine is, and also that these are predictions, they're probabilities, they're not facts.
Right.
I frankly, I don't think we've cracked the code on that more broadly, but it's an area that is important. And you can see some of it's just, is there a good engagement between the people implementing and building this and driving it and those who are going to be consuming it? Are they all working together? If you're educating and you're working together in that context, then you've got a much better shot. I saw a project a couple of years ago where it was understood at an executive level, literally sort of line of business lead. It was understood the potential value there, but down at the front office, in this case, it was a financial services company. What was very successful was doing over the shoulder kind of training, explanation with a small number of their markets and users, and explain them to what it meant and why it was valuable. And that so then started to permeate, because they made very, very careful selections of who was going to be in that little those pilot groups, that they were, I guess, kind of influencers or known by other people. And that was a good strategy, I think. Rather than throwing it out there and knowing that it's such an amazing model, it's so great, it's so accurate, it's going to be incredible. And then the first users, interaction with it, if they don't understand the prediction or it doesn't align with their judgment, then they can easily dismiss it, and then you've lost trust. So I feel like there's not a simple success criteria there, but I do see that as part of the kind of the ingredients here to doing this well.
That's a great call out. Great call out. And so we've hit through a whole bunch of different topics here, and just want to say thank you for giving us your insight here. Tremendous things to be thinking about for companies that are considering investing in predictions. And thank you for joining us today, Philip. It was great having you.
My pleasure, Chris. I really enjoyed it. Always good to work with you guys.